Welcome back to Mackenzie Woodworking. Today's project, we're doing some small epoxy river edge boxes. Here you can see them, and we're going to do them in various colors. And we've done the inside in wax colors. You can see the different ones. So we have a larger one in the center. So what I'm starting with is some natural edge maple. And these have been coated in epoxy. I coat them first, and once they dry off, and then we sand them down. And what they'll do is seal all the pores to stop all the bubbles from coming out. And if you find that your epoxy is still a bit tacky before you use sand, which you can use as corn flour or cornstarch. So here I am just applying some cornstarch over top of it. You can see the areas where it grabs, and I can just sand that all off smooth. And then once it all gets sanded, I'll just give it a good clean and just use the compressor and blow it all off. And then I'll cut it down to sizes. This is too large for my application. What I'm building is some jewelry boxes or novelty boxes. Some people call them art boxes, but they'll have a river edge on top. So you just want to make sure that you get everything sanded off nice and smooth. Like I said, these have all been sealed, and they only have to be sanded to 180 grit. Here's my form. So it's a form that you've probably seen on bigger projects and smaller projects. I have a clear base. I have a 1/4 inch clear epoxy already poured inside of it. And what I'm doing is just giving the surface a rough. This has sat for 5 days. And I'm using 220 here. So I just want to scuff up the surface so that it'll bond with the next pour of epoxy. Because what I plan on doing is that we'll pour another small coat, a clear coat over top of this, and we'll inlay our natural edge slabs into it. So here I am just mixing up some epoxy. You see there's not much there, but this is clear. And then once that gets in there, we'll just spread it around, and then I'll take a heat gun to it. The heat gun will disperse any of the bubbles and spread it around evenly. And one thing too is if you're doing this, you'll notice on the sides of the form I have some shims and door shims, and what that does is you want to make sure that your form is level. So before we even did the first pour, the base pour, we made sure that the form was all level both ways. So we've got that spread around, and then I'll just take a heat gun and just try and get out the last bits of it. Here we am. This is basically just to make sure there's no bubbles in it, and just help spread it around. It's actually pretty clear. So, and then once we get this, I'll just let this sort of level out on its own, and then we'll place in the natural edge maple slabs. Here they are. You see they're all cleaned up now, and we have them facing upwards. They're all pre-cut with the sides of the form. And now they're embedded down into the wet surface. And I just have some 10-pound weights. What I do is on my weights, I use these a lot, and when we're doing epoxy, I just put tuck tape around them, and that holds it down. So here's a product we're using. We're using Eco Epoxy, which is supplied to us by Windsor Plywood. They're building materials supply store in Western Canada. They're a great store. They've been around for about 50 years now. Great bunch of people. So if you ever need any product, help with some projects, go on down and see all the folks at Windsor Plywood. So here I am, just measuring off in my container. Eco Epoxy has to be measured off by volume, not weight. So these containers usually comes with the epoxy kits are great because they tell you exactly the amount you need. And this ratio is 2 to 1, and it's marked on the side of the container. So it looks like and I put the lid and put that away. And what I do is on the hardener, because I don't want to pour it directly out of the container, I'll put it into a coffee cup, Dixie cup, and then pour it from there, transfer it from there. And this only takes 1 part, so it's 2/3 to 1/3. And this is easier to pour in. And you can see that I've got a couple of smaller jars there in the front. That's the color that we'll be adding. So I'll mix this for about 5 minutes by hand, and then we'll add the color into it. And what I'll be using is a metal flake and a metallic. I use 1 part metal flake and 2 parts metallic. Now I'll just give it a good stir. What we use a lot in the shop for stirring paints and oils and everything is, if you notice these bamboo sticks, you can get them at the dollar stores, and they're good for picking things out, and you get them in a bag of about 25 or 50, and they're quite reasonable. So I've stirred that up for 5 minutes, and now I'm going to add my metallic and flake. And I usually keep a note of what the products are that we're using and the amount that we're putting in of each. So if you have to match a batch, you have a listing of what you're doing. So I jot down the number and I jot down what I'm going to put in. What I use is a popsicle stick, and I basically just use the end of it, and I'll put in 2 of those and then 1 of the flake. I found the pass. There's the popsicle stick. When you're doing colors, and especially custom mixes, always keep a good record of what you've done in case you ever have to match it up or you have a failed spot. You can always remix and match. And there's my flake. See it sparkling in the epoxy. Now we'll stir this for about a minute. Get it all stirred in good. You can see these shish kebab sticks work really well. They've got a paddle on the end of it. So there it is there. I'm after that bronze look, and whenever we swirl this along, it'll look like molten lava. Eco Epoxy has a great range of colors and metallic, solid colors, dyes. They have a really large range of colors, so check out their products. Here it is here. I've just poured it in, and now I'm just taking the heat gun to it. I prefer to use a heat gun over a torch. I found more control. You can see probably the metal flake in it. And what we'll do is just let that sit for a second, then I'll give it a couple of swirls. We do this about 2 or 3 times until we get the exact sort of design that we're after. But I'm just doing it now to make sure that it's all mixed up. But there you can see it there. And then what I'll come do is I'll come back and do it again over 3 or 4 hours until it starts getting a heavy enough body to hold the flake up into it. And that gives you an idea of what it's going to look like. Right now it's too liquid, don't have any body to it, so we want to wait till the epoxy gets a little bit more body. And there it is there after it's been set. And we've built a dam on the sides, which is going to go up a little bit higher. And this is with the silicone on both sides of it. I say back about 1/4 of an inch. And this is to stop any overflow. So we'll be putting clear coat epoxy now on top of it. So I'll just be pouring in over the color surface. So that's about 1/4 of an inch thick that we have in the bottom for the color surface, and then we have clear coat underneath that, which is another 1/4 inch. So right now we have about a 1/2 inch. And now I'll just fill the cavity with clear coat. And what I'm doing right now is sanding the surface with 220, and then we'll blow that off, clear it off, make sure that there's no imperfections in it that we want to take out now. And what they'll do is ensure that it'll bond good. So there it is there again. And it's all been blown off, and there's our clear there that's going in over top of it. And this will really highlight and give you depth to the river patterning in the bottom. And I like to do this on all our natural grain woodworks projects, because I want to see the edge of the wood. I want to see the edge of the tree, the contours and stuff. I don't like filling it right to the top with solid color. So we divide the color in 2. You can see we have some air bubbles, but I'll take the heat gun in once we get this in. There we go. Good pour. And we'll just take the heat gun and get those bubbles out, and then that'll set. Now I let this set for 5 days before I try and take it out of the form. And then to take the silicone off, what I use is a heat gun again, and you just warm with the silicone and you can peel it right off the wood. It's hard to sand it, so it's good to try and mechanically remove the silicone before you try and sand. Here I am just going over top of it and moving the resin around, and we'll get out any bubbles. And I'll let this rest for about an hour, and then I'll go back and do it again. As you can see, the heat really brings the heat to the surface, bubbles to the surface. And here's another panel that we're doing at the same time. This is the blue one. You can see that I'm going to do the exact same process. 220, just roughing up the surface and the edge. And you can see that I've poured a bit of a epoxy resin up towards the top to make it look like a waterfall down on the edge grain of the wood. We'll just give that a sand as well. Anything that's glossy, you actually want to take the gloss out of it and try and flatten that finish, and then you'll have a good bond. The same thing, I'll just use a blower and get that all cleaned off. And here's another one. And I just had a bit of dirt in there that I'm trying to sand out. I'll get that all sanded out as well. Same thing on the sides. I'm going to flatten all those surfaces, take the sheen off of it. And then I'll go through the process of how we measure these. Everybody has a hard time measuring a liquid volume. Epoxy is expensive and dear. You actually don't want to waste it. I usually have a couple of these set up, so if I do have some extra, I can pour it into it, top it off. But there it is, and give it a good pour. So we have the two of them already. Plus we already have one in the paint room set. So I'm just going to walk through the principle with you here, how we measure them. I have beans, and it'll depend on the size of the beans that you get, but I have a jar of them that we keep in the shop just for this purpose. So I pour them in up to the level that we want. I can flatten them off. If you notice, I've got written on the jar that 3/4 of a cup equals 1 cup per volume. There's a 25% void in the beans, so that means every 3/4 of a cup of beans you need 1 cup of liquid volume. And once we get these all to the level that we need, we'll transfer them to a container, and then I can measure off that container, and then I know the ratio that I have to mix to. I can take my solid ratio and then add the 25%, and then I usually add another 10 or 15% of volume, because you're always going to lose some product on the side of the containers and stuff. But I found this is the quickest and easiest and most accurate way. You can see I can go in and out and fill the voids. And I've done this in very large projects too. Sometimes if you don't have enough beans, you'll just divide it in segments. So I just have a piece of parchment paper there. This is a good way to transfer them so they're not all over the place. And then I'll just transfer that to a container, and then I can measure that off. I'm just measuring what I've got there. And it looks like I've got 300. I'm going to add 25% of that. So we need 375 milliliters. Plus I add another 25. So I'll mix up 400 milliliters of liquid. We'll see if that works out. And this just saves a lot of material and a lot of aggravation. And if you're doing this, you have to, all the beans are different sizes, so measure a cup of dry beans, pour water in the cup until it comes to the top, and then pour off the water and measure your water that fill the displacement, and then you'll know what your total is. And here you can see we've already poured the epoxy resin into the 2 molds, and we're just using the heat gun again. And like I said, I'll do this 2 or 3 times over the hour to make sure if there's any bubbles. But you can see from the side to the edge grain, because they're pre-sealed with epoxy, there's no air bubbles coming out of them. There's not a lot of air bubbles coming out of the whole thing. So here's one of the boards that we took out. And you can see I'm just wetting it there to show you. So this is called hazing. So I start with 80 grit, and this was all glossy. And whenever you're doing your first sand, you want to make sure that there's no glossy spots on it anywhere, so that it's hazed everywhere. And then what I do is just make a light pencil mark on top, and then I completely sand it, and you want to take that pencil mark off. You can see I got a small corner on my sandpaper there. I'm not too worried about it right now because these are just the final sand, the basic sand. But you see, there's a hard spot in front of it. So what I use is a scraping blade. You can get them at floor supply stores. They're about 6 inches long, and I use that to scrape off if you get any hard spots on your sandpaper. So I'll just do this 2 or 3 times, and then I'll check it as well with a square to make sure I haven't created any divots or anything. And this is 80 grit, and now I'm changing to 100 grit, and I'll do this all the way up to 220 with a random orbital sander. The same thing, I'll just make a light pencil mark, and I'll sand this until that comes off. This is now the top of the panels. So I don't cut the panels to size for the projects that I need until we do the final sand. Then we cut them aside, and then I'll do the edges. I'll edge sand and polish all the edges. So I'll go all the way through, and then I go to a 1/3 sheet vibrating flat sander. I find that works good on the epoxy, and we'll take that right up to 300 grit, and then I hand sand up to 1200 grit. Same thing, I'm just making some pencil marks. This will make sure that we get all the imperfections, because you don't want to leave any scratches in it or anything. This will come to really high sheen. Then we put on a sealer coat when we get this all sanded off. So you can see it there. If you see any shiny spots, that means that it's below your sanding surface. So what I use on this, you can get these. They're rather inexpensive, but they're file cleaners. If you notice, they're an abrasive cleaner that they use for cleaning files, but I find that it works good on sandpaper as well. You want to get off any bits that are on your sandpaper, or you're just going to wear that right into your unit. I really like these 1/3 sheet machines. They do a good job. And continuously blow off your surface. As you can see, it's coming clearer and clearer. That's just 220 right now. So, and I'll keep sanding that until I'm happy with that surface, and then I'll progress on to the next paper. And what I have is a big shop fan to my left there, so as I'm sanding, it's blowing all the particles away. You can see how it's getting clear. That's actually the back side. And we will be taking this to 600 on mechanical sanders, and then we'll hand sand it. Then it gets sprayed with lacquer. I use semi-gloss lacquer, and we'll spray them with lacquer. There's no fast way of doing this. Everybody's looking for an easy and a quick way of doing it. You just have to get at her and put on your headphones, listen to some music, and just enjoy. Put on good vibrations when you're sanding. But yeah, it's really starting to come out nice now. You can see the color in that maple. A friend of mine brought this into my shop a couple of years ago, so it's been quite dry. I like to make the back side because they will be, and you can see the top. There's a portion, the one that we had previously in the shop, and it's been all sanded and it's been lacquered. And you can see these are all ready to be lacquered now, but that's what they look like before you spray the lacquer on them. And then we spray about 8 coats of lacquer. We'll spray the first coat on, sand it off, spray a second coat on, give it another sanding, and that's the final sanding. And then we'll give it 6 top coats of lacquer. You see the ones up top were cut to size, and there'll be a couple of boxes, and I'll show you the boxes that we made out of them. They're jewelry boxes or keepsake boxes. So here's a jig that I made, and you can see we've already cut these sides and stuff. This is more of an epoxy resin video than it is the box making, but here's all my components. I use Osmo's wax, colored wax. So I do the front and the back panel, that's red. So the front and the back of the panel first. And then we have our sides and cut out components and the dado in it to accept the bottom. Then we glue our joints with Type-On glue. And I double glue the joints, so I glue both sides. Everything's falling down on me, but I just use a little artist brush. I find that it works good because you don't want glue all over the place, and you don't really want to wet this wood, especially if it's good quality. What I'm using to make these boxes is edge grain fir. I cut it out of a big beam. So it's old growth, but it's reused. I try to reuse a lot of, I have a lot of people bring me bits and pieces and beams and stuff, and I have the capability of a 20-inch bandsaw, so I can resaw a lot of lumber. So we just put those in the jig and slide that in. You see I've dadoed the panel, and I have the dado of the notch coming up because we'll actually be putting a lining on the inside of this as well. The lining will be supporting the drawer top, plus I want to bring that color up to the edges so that you can see the same color that's in the drawer. This little glue jig that I made, clamp, it works great for small projects and boxes and stuff. I just clamp it in there. It's easy to put in shims to size wherever you need to be. Holds it nice and flat. And what I did on this one, I made a couple other ones, but this one I put a piece of plastic laminate on the bottom so the glue peels off of it quite easy, or paint or anything else. So it keeps it clean and flat. And those are cam locks that I've got there, so once I get the box in place, I can just put a wedge in that I need in between and then just cam lock it in. And it works well because sometimes you just don't have enough hands. If you notice, I'm dabbing the glue on. I see so many people painting it. You don't want to paint it on, you want to dab it on. Since you get enough. There you go, they're all set in. There. Just clamps in. The corners nice and square. And just put a shim on the side. You don't need a lot of pressure on these. Just enough to bring the joints together. And when I get it all together, what I usually do is around the top, I like to use friction tape, electrical tape. And just check it for square. Make sure that it's all square. Which it is. I'll let that sit for 2 hours now, and then it's enough that I can take it out, and then I'll take it to the table saw. I have a jig set up on the table saw that I can do splines on the side, corner splines, and what we use is a dark walnut for the corner splines. And here's my friction tape. I like using friction tape because you can pull it and it pulls everything nice and tight. A bit of dust on it, doesn't like to stick to anything. Just pulling the top corners in nice and tight. I'll just give that a couple of wraps. I find that the friction tape works a lot better than masking tape because it does stretch and it pulls it nice and tight. So there it is coming out of the jig, and you can see how nice and tight the miter corners are. And I've already ran that on the jig for cutting the corner spleens, which you've probably seen lots of videos on. There's lots of that online. A lot of guys have all kinds of fancy jigs. Mine's pretty simple. But I do, every time I have a small piece of hardwood left or some color or something, I'll cut it all up, and the size that I need, I have a 1/8 can, 1/4 inch, and 3/8, I believe. What this can is, a gentleman, a friend of mine, dropped me off an entire box of flooring, so I cut up a bunch of the pieces of the flooring and use that for my splines, and it works really good. And I just use the Type-On glue to glue them in. And then once we get them all in and those are set, I just cut off the waste with a bandsaw and sand them all off smooth. You see, I just use a bit of styrofoam to bring it up so I can do them all at the same time, like so that they're off the table. And I cut my miters on a table saw. I don't use a sliding compound saw. I use a table saw with a jig on it. And it gives you perfect miters. It's easy to adjust. It's an adjustable jig, so if it goes a little bit out of square, you can set it up again. But and I can come back in about an hour and cut those off. I should make them, you can see the bottom panel looks quite nice in there. This is a great product to work with, this edge grain fur. You can see the color on the inside. That's that Osmos wax. it's a nice product to work with. It's really smooth to the finish. What my panels on the bottom are cypress. They have a nice even grain to them, and it's a solid wood. Not a lot of movement in it, so they'll sit there, and then I'll just wait till it dries, go and have a coffee. I'm just taking off the excess now. And I always take off the excess because then you can check to make sure that your spline went right to the corner, right to the inside. If you leave that on, you think, oh, well, just sand that off, but it may be hiding a shadow, and you may not be getting right to the corner with your miter, so I take it off. Now I'm just cutting the panel to size. What I'll do is I'll make a notch in the front of the box, and so that the top of the lid protrudes, and that will be your handle. You see, I've just freehand a couple of sizes. I want one side of it to have a long radius, and the handle will be offset. And I just have marks that show me the inside of the box and the outside of the box. And then I'll just follow through with my radius. You see at this time, it hasn't been lacquered yet. So what I do is I do all my rough fitting on all my pieces first, and then I'll sand them all and fit everything. I'll just put temporary pins in it. These lids will just be pinned hinges on either side. I use a special 3/16 brass rod. And then I'll size this in, and then I can cut it into the box, and then I'll take it in and give it a final spray. And I'll just round all over those edges. And there's the final product. As you can see, the top one was the one that we're just cutting on the bandsaw, and another one, the lower one, we just come in square. You can see they're just pinned on the sides. Came out quite nice. And you can see my lining on the inside of them, and the lining is cypress as well. So the lining comes up 1.5 inches along the inside, and that supports the lid as it goes down. And then I put a detail on the bottom, which color matches the inside, and I put a rabbit all the way around the bottom. You can see the swirl and stuff. So I hope you've learned a few things on this, and you don't have to pour a giant epoxy table. Do some small projects. Thanks a lot for watching. Please subscribe.